Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Max Tritt, a fisheries biologist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA. Max and I first crossed paths years ago when he put in a pitch to bring his stream erosion table to Exploration Station at the Maine Science Festival, and I have been a fan since then. His science path and path to Maine has been filled with a lot of different work, starting with a 20-year career in the Army. I loved hearing Max's passion for streams and rivers, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So Max, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I am delighted to have you. You might be my first federal employee. I'm going to have to go back and check my episode notes, but I think you might be. You are a longtime friend of the Science Festival and science in general, and I know that your path in science has been very different than most people's. Before we started recording, you started talking about, as a 40-year federal employee, the different hoops you're going to have to jump through. So if I've got this right, the first 20 years of that were in the military. Is that right?
That is correct. I spent 20 years in the Army, driving, fixing, shooting tanks.
So very different than working river restoration for NOAA.
It is a stretch.
So why the Army first?
Lack of direction, lack of any compelling urge. My parents swore up and down that they offered to send me to college, but I don't remember that conversation. So I thought I had a bit of wanderlust, and the Army offered me a plane ticket. So I was there.
So I'm curious, while you were in the Army, when did you think, all right, environmental science, river work, that's what I want to do next?
I always wanted to do it. I secretly always wanted to just go play in the creek, It's something I started doing probably 5 or 6 years old, and I'm still doing it.
When did you figure out that you could do that as a college career and then an actual career?
Probably 15 years into the Army. I had taken bits and pieces of college courses, nothing focused, and then was in Western Washington. I was in Tacoma, Washington, and I started scuba diving. And somebody said, you can volunteer with these guys. So I started doing eelgrass surveys in Commencement Bay on a volunteer basis, working with the county. It was awesome. And that's really how I started working in the marine science field, was on scuba, counting eelgrass shoots.
I know Tacoma a little bit. We lived in Seattle for 3 years. Was that towards the bay? Where were you doing the surveys?
If you know the area, it was Ruston Way. So it was basically the south side of Commencement Bay, pretty much a built-up touristy kind of spot, restaurants and clubs and shops of various sorts. But there was a couple of salmon streams that ran through there, went up the hill into the north end of Tacoma. And one was a viable salmon stream. So they said, very curious about the nursery area, just at the estuary, if you will, where the stream met the bay. And apparently it held more than a few fish. So it paid off.
So how long did you do that volunteer work in Washington?
Probably 2 or 3 years. While I was still at UW. I was active duty and then retired and moved away and came back. So probably 2 or 3 years while on active duty, in spite of the tempo and the things you have to go through, there's quite a bit of downtime. And I took advantage of that, whether it be scuba diving around the Puget Sound area or going up into the Cascades. One of my favorites was over on the Olympic Peninsula at Olympic National Park, where the Elwha River, one of the cornerstone of dam removals in America. It's a huge impact. And now 10, 15 years later, it's a great restoration story.
So did you grow up in the Pacific Northwest?
I grew up in Ohio. I grew up on Lake Erie. The river I grew up on was actually, the name was the Chagrin River, about 30 miles east of Cleveland. And we had a salmon run. And people lined the river when the fish were trying to migrate through. And just with treble hooks, snagging these stocked coho, I guess they were. But yeah, I encountered my first salmon probably at 16 on the Chagrin River in Ohio.
Okay, so you went from there to the Army, ended up in the Pacific Northwest, where honestly you could not be in a better spot for appreciating, I think, sea-run fish and salmon in particular. After you retired from the Army, is that when you kind of further built into being able to do this cool river work?
Right. Like I said, I went to UW. Once I retired, I did not have enough credits, so I went back to school and really jumped in with both feet. And the professors there were all about marine science or water chemistry. It was a great environment to learn from true professionals that dedicated their life to it. So it was a watershed. It flipped a switch for me. It's like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. all in.
So I got to ask, when were you at the University of Washington, finishing up?
2003.
We just missed each other.
Yeah?
We lived in Seattle from 1997 to 2000. And my husband was at UW in the physics department.
In Seattle.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I have a diploma from the University of Washington. It doesn't say Tacoma on it. It says UW. And I've never been on the Maine campus.
No kidding.
Although I was wearing a UW hat all morning.
So I also know that you ended up in Florida for a bit. So Ohio, all over the place with the Army, Pacific Northwest, Florida. This is all part of my grand plan to get you to explain how you ended up in the great state of Maine.
It's part of it because once I graduated from UW, I was working for a small outfitter there called REI. You may have heard of them.
Yeah.
So I was working for REI, had a garage full of great gear and no future. So I finished up at UW, started shopping my resume. And as a avid scuba diver, that was on the resume, of course. And the National Park Service offered me a job at Biscayne National Park in Homestead, Florida, scuba diving. And so my girlfriend, now wife and mother of my children, we moved to Florida from Tacoma without ever having even seen the place. Just packed it up and left.
So did being in the Army help you understand what it would be like to work for the National Park Service?
Not at all. I was combat arms. Back in the day, there was few, if any, women around ever because we were in the field, we were covered in mud and we were getting shot at and shooting people or whatever. But there was no women involved back then. Things have changed dramatically for the better, depending on your perspective. But no, when I got to South Florida, it was myself, my boss, and the resource manager chief, and the rest of the park staff was almost exclusively women.
Oh, what a switch.
So I was not really prepared for that at all. And I keep hearing how, the women in science, and it's like, we need more women. Once I started doing marine science, that's really all I've ever worked for was women. Not a problem.
So how is it at NOAA?
My boss is a female. Her boss is a female. The regional administrator is a male, but the head of NOAA, Gina Raimondo, female.
So NOAA, for listeners who aren't in on the acronym game, is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association.
Right. We're the people who bring you hurricanes, but we're also the people who manage fisheries, specifically the National Marine Fisheries Service. It's a small slice of NOAA.
So did you get tired of scuba diving in Florida and decide you wanted to come somewhere where the climate is generally nicer and not so gross in the summer?
No, I don't think I would ever get tired of scuba diving. After being on a tank for 20 years, getting kind of banged around in the turrets, my back was just about shot. And bouncing around on Boston whalers for another 5 or 10 years, it took its toll. And it became painful to actually do that, getting to and from the workplace. But I think more importantly, I've got 2 beautiful daughters, and we chose not to raise them in South Florida. My wife was Quebecois, so we're going to move up I-95. I'm okay with Jacksonville, maybe. Between Daytona and Jacksonville, I'm thinking just a little further north. And I didn't know she met the far other end of I-95. So we're in a good place now. I come to love living in Maine. There's always something to do. It might be 20 below, but you can still get out there and do it if you've got the wherewithal and the right gear. And after a lifetime of trying to get it right, I've gotten rid of all the wrong gear. So we're out there.
You had mentioned the river restoration in the Olympics. You said it was probably the first great dam removal, river restoration. And I know that you worked quite a bit on the Penobscot River dam removal restoration. And you've done great amount of education explaining why it's so important. So please dive into a little bit of what you do with NOAA and marine fisheries and your river work in particular.
It's come full circle. I like to say I did biological science. I was a field biologist for the Park Service. We were doing surveys. We were chasing fish and lobsters and turtles, all that. Moved to Maine. I started with NOAA working ESA Section 7 consultation. So that's in any project that the federal government endorses or executes or permits in many cases. It has to go through a Section 7 ESA review for its potential impacts to endangered species. I did that for probably 8 years, 9 years. I like to say that's the political science part. It's a bit of a stretch, but work with me. So now, doing outreach, I think that's the social science part. I really kind of grudgingly took it on because I was having fun doing Section 7. I got to travel around work sites and see big trucks and all this stuff. But really engaging with middle schoolers that aren't too cool for school, like high schoolers, middle schoolers who have a much better attention span than do elementary kids. Middle schoolers who have just a little bit of knowledge about a lot of things and a thirst for more things. So I really like to engage with 12 to 14-year-olds. Maybe that's my mindset, but I have a lot of fun when I see kids get it.
So walk me through that. What does that look like? What are you doing with these students?
I have what's called a Stream Smart table, and it's basically 4x8 sheet of plywood with little rails around it. It's full of recycled crushed plastic. It's a stream erosion table. And we've got some trees and critters and people and different structures we put on there to show how human activities have impacted the ability for sea-run fish to make their migrations, whether they be American eels that spawn in saltwater or the other 11 species here in Maine that spawn in freshwater and then migrate back out to sea. So if they can't make that loop, any trajectory that species is going down the tubes. So I go through the process and I show them little tiny culverts and how to put your thumb on a garden hose and water comes out fast and spray your mom. It's great. And it's the same effect when they put a small culvert on a stream. There's physics involved with it, and I don't fully understand it, but it works out well because the recycled plastic is multicolored. So you can really see that acceleration around the pipe and how you have a barrier like that and it slows the water down upstream. It gets deeper, it gets warmer, it gets slower, which is great for predators, invasive species and the like, but not so much for migratory fish. And so I go through that process. And when the kids understand what's happening, it's pretty gratifying, you know? We're just down in Washington Academy in East Machias 2 weeks ago. And this was high school. We went through 5 or 6 different iterations of the Stream Smart table over 2 days. But we walked down to the Machias Dike Bridge and saw issues with that. But there's the Sunrise Trail. And so we walked down the Sunrise Trail. And because of the storms recently, the culverts are blown out. It was overtopped. And I heard one guy says, "That's what the guy was talking about." Yeah, he gets it. Like, so yeah.
So did you build the table, or was it, you said you took on this role reluctantly. Was it because you had to start from scratch or because you were taking over from someone else?
I think both. I don't know if you remember Tara Lake. She had it. I don't know how often she took it out. She didn't take it out as often as I do, which is like twice a week, which is kind of overwhelming. But I think Tara owned it at one time. But to answer your question, it came from Pat Soroyce at the Sustainable Forestries Initiative down in Augusta. And I just met with him recently, do some work on it. I said, "So are you a fisheries guy?" "I'm a forester, I'm a logger." And so I think the genesis of that Stream Smart table, the Stream Smart program writ large, was to help private landowners not lose access to their timberlands. So that all these small culverts down east getting blown out every storm. They're losing a section they're losing a culvert. So they're losing access to timberlands. So I think Stream Smart was Audubon took it on. And then Project Share, they really drove it home with helping the private landowners down east to redo a lot of the culverts.
So have you taken it on the road and done these exercises with adults and grownups as a way to also connect the dots between the river and the runs and dam removal?
Yes, as recently as last week. Maine DOT. I work with a couple of folks down there doing Section 7. And hey, would you bring your Stream Smart table to our Bring Your Kids to Work Day? Yeah, okay, whatever. If I have time and capacity, I'll go. And as it turned out, for every kid, there was a parent or two. And that's really the best bang for the buck is when you get multi-generational exposure to it. We go to like the science fair, for example, a lot of parents, a lot of chaperones. But I think at the Common Ground Fair, we've been to for several years. And so there's always a troop of kids coming through there and their parents are looking over their shoulder. And that's kind of preaching to the choir sort of thing at the Common Ground Fair. But anytime we can share our message with folks about how to build a better culvert and really what that means to sea-run fish, the ecosystems, the better.
So I think there's been extraordinary headway and successes that have happened in Maine and rivers in particular. Maybe I'm just trying to find all the stuff that I think is really cool and positive. But the dam removal has been really extraordinary, and it's happened pretty much along the timeline that I've lived here. Am I being too rosy about this, or is it really as big of a deal and as big of a success as it seems like to me?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Some people will tell you it's a shell game. With the Penobscot River Restoration Trust, yep, we took out a couple of dams, And yep, we've refitted a couple other ones. So that's about a zero-sum game. The main stem of the Penobscot is alive and well until you get to Milford, and we're still working on that. You look at other places, maybe not the Kennebec or the Andro, the Sheepscot, the Maine's biggest rivers. You're getting some success there. It's a slow process. It's legal. It's time-consuming. A lot of players. But I think you drill down a little farther and you'll see smaller towns that have dams. Yeah, this dam has been here for 100 years. It's not doing anything except holding back water and preventing fish from getting home. It's going to cost $1 bazillion to retrofit it. Oh, by the way, that's going to increase your taxes. So the smaller towns are taking a good hard look at their barriers, their dams, whatever they may be, to figure out ways to open it up, reconnect habitat for fish migration. So I think it is moving along. Different places, you get different degrees of success. Down in outlet stream, China Lake, maybe. Landis Hudson and the Maine Rivers folks did some great work down there the last 5 or 6 years or so. And they pulled out or bypassed 6 different dams. So now there's this huge influx of migratory fish. The alewives love it. It's a big success story, that project.
So if you were going to go to one of these small towns, like you, Max, the fisheries guy, would you say that you would have to lean more heavily on the biological science, the political science, or the social science to try to explain why it's so important to increase the access for sea-run fish?
I would have to say that it would depend on the water body. It would depend on how far is the water body itself, what type of habitat it is, what's above it. Maybe you talk about the finances. I mean, there's some towns that have deep pockets, and there are other towns that do not. There are some towns that lean right on the political spectrum, and there are towns that lean left on the political spectrum. So I would, like I do with my StreamSmart table, I go in and I say, okay, this is a middle school. I'm not going to throw a bunch of GRE words at a 9-year-old. Okay, that's just not going to work. You'll lose them pretty quick. So I think you tailor your presentation to the audience. I think that is key in most outreach or any type of public engagement. You tailor your presentation to the audience.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I think it's easy for people to think that you just pack something out of a box and present that one thing and it works the same everywhere. And you can have parameters, right? But any good science or any good engagement, every situation is literally unique. There's no one thing that's going to work everywhere. And it's a good reminder to hear that.
They call it variation on a theme.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's that same thing. All right. What's your favorite fish?
Sturgeon.
Because?
Who doesn't love dinosaurs? Because they're awesome. I was going down to Wiscasset last year, going across the Kennebec, Richmond-Dresden Bridge, and did a Section 7 consultation on. So I had to go across that. And then went up across the Eastern River, a little grassy, more of a bayou than anything. But of course, I'm an hour early. I was in the Army. That's what I do. So I'm way early. So I pull off a little turnout there, and I'm eating my granola bar, my apple, enjoying the coffee. And bait fish are jumping in the river. You go, yeah, whatever. And I hear a splash. Okay. And I hear another splash. It got my attention now. So I'm watching. And so within about 20 minutes, saw 4 sturgeon jump completely out of the water. And the biggest one was as big as me. And it did a complete 360, flashed its big white dinosaur belly, and it made my day. So sturgeon are my favorite.
Is that the first time you've seen that happen in Maine?
I've seen them jump before, but never that spectacular. There's stories of them jumping. You go down to the Sea Dog on the Andro at Brunswick, tops them, and it's a rite of passage for the summertime. You sit there and enjoy your beverage and watch fish jump. But last year before last, one of our senior leadership National Marine Fishery Service came to visit. So we took her around, did the dog and pony show, different dams and bypasses and work we've done. And we ended up at Waterville on the Kennebec. Hey, let's go out on the back deck and see if there's any fish. As if on command, sturgeon started jumping for the boss. Like, yes.
That's great. Do you still scuba dive?
I have not scuba dived in a few years. I'm holding out for warm, clear water. I learned in dark, murky, cold water, but it's like, that water's dirty. No, it's not. It is full of food. It is so full of food, it's murky because it's thick. I could be okay with a less thicker water and a whole lot warmer water. I dove probably 3 days out of 5 in South Florida for 8 years. And so I got my fill, but I'll never be tired of it. Given the opportunity, somebody needs a dive master in Hawaii, I'm there.
I might learn to scuba dive for that opportunity. So when we set up, when I emailed you and said, hey, Max, I would like to talk to you, your response back was, well, besides, sure, what could go wrong, which I really appreciated, was that you had retirement seminar to go to. So it sounds like you might be here at the end of your official government career winding down. Are you going to try to stay in the world of marine sciences and marine life, or are you going to take a total break?
Well, I've got 2 daughters in college, so I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. I like to think that I would stay connected to it in some way, shape, or form. I did a Stream Smart presentation at local salmon clubs on the Penobscot River. And so here's 2 legends in salmon ecology. One is Ed Baum, and the other was Bucky Owens, sitting in the front row. And I am like petrified because these are the guys. These are the Mount Rushmore guys, right? And as I start talking, I do my thing, I hit my stride, and they're both sitting there in folding chairs with their arms crossed and their feet crossed at their ankles, sitting there smiling, shaking their heads. You know, they're probably in their 80s now. We just lost Fred Kirchis recently. My sympathies go to the family. And I work with Dan, his son. But between Bucky and Ed and Fred Kirchis, those guys spent their whole life studying, advocating for sea-run fish. I would like to think I'd do the same thing.
It makes me happy because I've had the great good fortune of watching you do your outreach with a bunch of kids milling about you and parents, and you have a real gift. It is a joy to watch you. No, seriously, I'm not kidding. You beam when you do it. And you were right. You have got those kids' attention. And it's nice to be watching from a little bit afar and watching them get it. It's really fun.
I appreciate you saying that. It's work. It's good kind of work. I don't know if you remember Sarah, was my coworker, was a contractor. And so when the pandemic struck, they said, okay, take your laptops home and we'll call you when we need you. All right. So we worked from home for a couple of years. Sarah ended up going to Bermuda to telework. She met, fell in love, and married a rum maker and has never been seen since. So this is a one-man show. I mean, you know, those 5 buckets of plastic. I mean, yeah, it's work, setting it up, tearing it down. But it really is a joy to see those kids kind of understand what I'm talking about. And it's like, yeah, I got culvert in my driveway. It's always full of dirt. It's always full of trees and grass and stuff. They recognize what's going on around them. I think that's part of the educational process for them to recognize their environment.
I feel like we just barely scratched the surface of your, I don't want to say long and tremendous career because that makes it sound like it's over, and it's not over yet. But I definitely have a slightly better appreciation of your incredible passion for rivers and creeks. And I'm really grateful that we're able to talk about not just your work, but NOAA. I think it's important to remind people that the government actually does some great outreach and research, and you base your work on a lot of really solid science. And it's a good reminder that when we all pool our money together and ask the government to do something, that oftentimes it actually gets done really well. So I appreciate that.
That's the cornerstone of our outreach, is the science that's going on in the background. We're not just making this stuff up. This is cutting edge science as we know it. And you hear people say that science lies. Science doesn't lie. Science evolves. Science learns, and it keeps going. There's been more than a few PhD who have debunked their own dissertation because of the continuing growing body of knowledge. So what I do is based on the work of an awful lot of people. And from the Science Center down at Woods Hole, the Restoration Center, those guys are doing huge work. If there's a project that's underway, it's probably the Restoration Center's got they drew it up, they're digging in the dirt, or they're laying out the cash for it. They're heavily vested. And then the policy guys I work with out of Gloucester. So it's a team effort. And I don't think I could have found a better place to land, a better team to work with. You're not ever going to get rich in the federal government monetarily, but working with the guys and gals I work with have enriched me greatly over the last 15 years.
Well, science as we know it, I think there's no better place to end on a Friday afternoon. So I appreciate it, Max. I particularly enjoy how every now and then you and I cross paths in the Bangor City Forest because you are whizzing past me on a mountain bike. And always funny because I see you going by and I'll do a big hi. And inevitably I'm with my husband and he's like, who is that again? I'm like, oh, it's Max. So it's very funny. I love running into you in all the places that you get to run into people in Maine that, you know, this is the best part about being in this big, huge state with a small population is we do run into people all the time. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much for both this conversation and your work.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. The Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.